The call came at 6:43 in the morning. I know the exact time because I'd already made 2 cups of coffee, one for me, one for my father, who was sitting 4 feet away at my kitchen table in his reading glasses and an old flannel shirt, working through a bowl of oatmeal like a man with nowhere to be. My phone lit up with Renata's name. I almost let it go to voicemail. I almost did. But I answered because that's what I'd always done, answered, accommodated, adjusted. And my sister's voice came through the line flat and strangely careful, like someone reading from a script they'd rehearsed but didn't fully believe in, and she said, "Mara, I need you to sit down. Dad passed away last night, and I need you to know before you hear it from anyone else that we've already handled everything. The house, the account, all of it. He updated his will 6 months ago. You don't need to come home." I didn't say a word. I looked across my kitchen at my father, who had lowered his spoon and was watching me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something between grief and relief and a very old, very quiet shame. I turned slightly away from him and said into the phone, very calmly, "Okay, Renata, thank you for letting me know." #3, full script. There's a version of my childhood where everything looks fine. 2 girls raised in a brick ranch house on Crestwood Avenue in Dayton, Ohio. A father who worked maintenance at a printing company for 22 years and coached youth soccer on weekends. A mother who kept a spotless kitchen and made sure we were at church every Sunday in matching cardigans. From the outside, from any reasonable distance, it looked like an ordinary, functional, loving family. And parts of it were. I want to be honest about that, because this story isn't about hatting where I came from. It's about what happens when love gets used against you so slowly and so gently that you don't recognize the wound until you're already bleeding out. I left Dayton at 26. I had a master's degree I was still paying for, a job offer from an insurance firm in Chicago, and the kind of optimism that only survives in people who haven't yet learned what it costs. I remember the day I drove away. My mother cried at the curb in a way that felt performative even then, not grief exactly, but a kind of announcement of grief, for the benefit of the neighbors watching from their driveways. My father hugged me for a long time and said very quietly into my hair, "Make something real, Mara." Those were his exact words. I held on to them for years. I still do. Renata, 4 years younger, stood a little behind my mother with her arms crossed and a look on her face I can only describe as satisfied. She was 22. She was not leaving. And I think, even then, she understood something about that decision that I didn't. That staying wasn't the sacrifice it appeared to be. That staying was a strategy. The money started almost immediately. Not as an explicit demand, that's not how my family operated. It was subtler than that. It was a phone call from my mother 3 months after I moved, mentioning in a casual, sighing way that the furnace was making a sound again, and that your father's hours got cut this month, and it's just so cold here, Mara, and I don't know how we'll manage, not a request, just information, the way you describe the weather. And I would say, "How much?" And she'd pause, as if the question surprised her, and then she'd say a number, and I would send it. That was the template. It never changed. Over 11 years, I sent home somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000 every single month. I have the bank records. I am a financial compliance analyst. I audit documents for a living. I build spreadsheets the way other people build furniture, carefully and with intention. And I have every wire transfer saved in a folder I started keeping in year 3, when something in me began to understand, wordlessly, that I might need it someday. $3,000 a month sounds like a lot, and it was. I drove a car with 140,000 miles on it and deferred my own retirement contributions for 4 years to make sure those transfers never bounced. I didn't take a real vacation until I was 32. I wore the same winter coat for 6 years. None of that was heroic. I'm not telling you this to make myself sound noble. I'm telling you because I need you to understand the arithmetic of what I built and what it cost me and what it was used for. Because I found out, much later, that the furnace was replaced in 2016 and has worked perfectly since. That the car repairs I funded across 3 consecutive months in 2019 cost significantly less than I sent. That the medications I wired money for in 2021, when my father's heart was giving them worry, were real, but that a portion of what I sent during that period was redirected, quietly, to a down payment on a car for Renata. Not a used car, a new one. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My father's name is Gerald Ellison. He's 68 years old, and he has the hands of someone who spent 30 years doing physical work, broad, calloused, slightly bent at the knuckles from the cold. He is not a demonstrative man. He doesn't make speeches or declarations. He shows love through small, stubborn acts of consistency, fixing things without being asked, remembering the names of people you mentioned once in passing, showing up. He is not perfect. He made choices over the years that I didn't always agree with, including staying out of conflict longer than he should have, which is a diplomatic way of saying he let things happen that he should have stopped. But he is a good man. That distinction matters to me, even now. His health started declining in the spring of 2022. Atrial fibrillation, an irregular heartbeat that required medication, monitoring, and a significant reduction in stress. The cardiologist told him, and told my mother, that his environment needed to be calm and consistent, that he needed to eat well, sleep properly, and avoid elevated anxiety wherever possible. What happened next is that Renata moved back into the house. She had been living with a boyfriend in an apartment across town, and the relationship had ended, and she needed somewhere to go. Under any other circumstances, that would simply be a daughter coming home, nothing unusual about it. But Renata moved back the same month my father was diagnosed, and within 60 days she had reorganized the household around herself in a way that was either extraordinary coincidence or extraordinary calculation. I still debate which it was. Maybe both. She managed his pill schedule. She drove him to appointments. She screened his phone calls, gently, reasonably, with perfectly logical explanations. He's resting, Mara. You know the doctor said he tires easily. Asterisk, or he's having a hard week, maybe try again Sunday. Asterisk, and Sunday would come and the call would go short, clipped, my father sounding muffled and distant on the line, like a man speaking from the bottom of a well. I noticed. I want to be very clear that I noticed. But I talked myself out of what I was seeing, the way you do when you don't want to believe the obvious thing because believing it would require you to act on it. I told myself Renata was being responsible. I told myself I was being paranoid, maybe even jealous. I told myself the distance made me dramatic. I flew home in October of 2022. I had booked the trip to see my father's new cardiologist with him and to help review his medications, because that is what I do. I research, I organize, I build systems. When I arrived, Renata met me at the door before I could knock, which was strange, and she hugged me in a way that felt like a checkpoint rather than a greeting. My father was in the living room in his recliner, and he looked smaller than I remembered, but his eyes lit up when I walked in. He held my hand the entire afternoon, and we talked for hours while Renata moved around the edges of the room, bringing tea, adjusting the thermostat, making small adjustments to my presence in ways I couldn't quite articulate. At one point, I asked my father directly, "Dad, are you happy? Is this working for you, having Renata here?" He looked at me for a long moment before he answered, and then he said, "Asterisk, your sister works hard." Which was not an answer to my question. I noticed that too. The appointment with the cardiologist went well. His numbers were stable. On my second day there, I tried to sit with my mother, Dolers, and have a real conversation about the financial arrangements, who was managing what the monthly costs actually were, whether the money I was sending was being allocated properly. My mother made us both tea, sat down across from me, and then proceeded to spend 45 minutes describing Renata's sacrifices in loving detail, while deflecting every specific question I asked with a pleasant, practiced vagueness. "We're managing fine, Mara. Renata handles most of that now. I wouldn't worry about the specifics, sweetheart. You have enough on your plate." I drove back to Chicago the next day with a feeling I didn't have a name for yet. Something between suspicion and grief. Something like watching a door close from the outside and not being sure if you locked yourself out or were locked out. I kept sending the money. Of course I did. Because my father's heart condition was real and his medications were real, and whatever else was happening, I was not going to let the legitimate needs go unmet because I was uncomfortable with the ambiguous ones. That, I think, is what Renata understood about me better than I understood about myself. that I would always choose to err on the side of generosity. That my fear of being the cold, selfish daughter who abandoned her family would always outpace my anger at being used. She had learned that about me years before I'd learned it about myself, and she built her entire plan around it. In 2023, I got a promotion, senior analyst, a 12% salary increase and a new title that meant nothing to anyone outside my office but meant everything to me personally, because I had earned it at a time when two of my colleagues with more seniority had been passed over, and I knew it was mine because of a specific 2-year project I had driven nearly alone. I called home to tell my parents. My mother said, "That's wonderful, honey. I'll tell Renata, she'll be so pleased." My father wasn't available. He was resting. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes after that call, not crying, just still. The way you are when something small confirms something large that you were hopping wasn't true. The following month, my transfer was deposited as usual. I had not raised the amount despite the raise. I had made a quiet decision, the first quiet decision in a long sequence of quiet decisions, that I would hold that margin for myself, that I was allowed to do that. It sounds so small, reading it back, but at the time it felt enormous. It felt like the first sentence of a story I didn't know I was writing yet. My father arrived at my apartment on a Tuesday in March. I didn't know he was coming. He had taken a Greyhound, a 6-hour bus from Dayton, which for a 68-year-old man with a heart condition is not a trivial thing. And he appeared at my door at 11 in the morning with one small suitcase, his good coat, and a look on his face that I had only seen once before, at my grandmother's funeral. The look of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has finally decided to put it down. I let him in. I made him sit. I made him eat something. And then I sat across from him and waited, because that is what you do when someone has traveled 6 hours to tell you something. You wait, and you let them find the words at whatever pace their courage allows. It took him most of the afternoon. He told me things in pieces, not in order. He told me that Renata had brought a man to the house, a notary, introduced casually as a friend 2 Sundays ago, when my mother was at her sister's. He told me that there had been paperwork, which he had signed, which he was told was a routine update to a power of attorney document. He told me that he had been given the papers quickly, and that his reading glasses had not been nearby, and that Renata had been standing over him explaining the pages in a steady, reassuring voice while he initialed. He told me he hadn't thought much about it until a week later when a name stuck in his mind. Something he'd glimpsed on the document, a phrasing about last will and testament rather than power of attorney, and when he went looking for the paperwork, it wasn't where it should have been. He had asked Renata about it. She had smiled at him and said it was just the attorney reorganizing his records, that there was nothing to worry about, that he needed to rest. That was when he packed his suitcase. He didn't tell me all of this cleanly or confidently. He told it to me the way old men tell things they are ashamed of, in fragments, with long pauses, with his eyes on his hands. And somewhere in the middle of it, I realized I was holding my breath, and I made myself release it, and I said, "Dad, it's okay. You're here, just keep going." When he finished, we sat quietly for a moment. Outside, Logan Square was doing its ordinary Tuesday afternoon thing. A bus going by, someone's music from the apartment below, the distant mechanical groan of a garbage truck. The ordinary world, indifferent and continuous. I said, "Dad, do you understand what I think happened?" He looked at me. "She changed the will." "She had you sign something that changed the will." "Yes." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "Can she do that?" "Not legally, not the way she did it, no." I didn't tell him about the plan that was already forming. He didn't need to carry that. He was 68 and tired, and his heart was medically compromised, and what he needed was sleep, food, and the particular peace of being in a place where no one was managing him. I gave him my bedroom. I slept on the pull-out in my office. I ordered Thai food, and we watched a documentary about migratory birds that he fell asleep 20 minutes into, which I sat and watched alone with the volume low, thinking. I am very good at thinking quietly. It is, professionally and personally, one of my strongest skills. I can hold a large amount of information in a structured way, and examine it from multiple angles without losing the thread. That night I went through everything I knew and organized it methodically, the way I would approach a compliance audit, not with emotion driving the process, but with emotion acknowledged and then set aside while the analytical work got done. What I knew: my father had signed a document he did not fully understand, under conditions designed to minimize his comprehension. No reading glasses, no prior notice, a trusted family member explaining the content verbally rather than allowing him to read it independently, the document removed from the premises afterward. I knew the approximate timing. I knew the name of the notary had not been mentioned, which meant either he didn't catch it or Renata had obscured it. I knew my mother had not been present. What I needed: a copy of the document, and to establish as clearly as possible the circumstances under which it was signed. The following morning, I called a probate attorney, not to file anything, not yet, but to understand the landscape. I had a conversation that lasted 45 minutes, taking notes in my own shorthand, asking the kind of precise questions that made the attorney pause and say, at one point, "You seem to know quite a bit about this already." I told him I worked in financial compliance. He said that explained it. What I learned confirmed what I already suspected: a will signed under conditions that could be characterized as undue influence, particularly with an elderly person with a documented medical vulnerability, in the absence of independent legal counsel, with the document controlled and withheld by a beneficiary, was potentially challengeable. Potentially. The word I kept hearing. The law operates slowly and cautiously, and it does not like the word potentially as much as the word certainly. I needed more. I also needed to know exactly what the document said. My father stayed with me for 4 days before Renata called. Those 4 days were, in many ways, the strangest and most important of my adult life. We talked more than we had in years, not about Renata, not about the will, but about everything else. He told me about a trip he had taken to see a baseball game in Cincinnati as a child, described in such precise, affectionate detail that I felt like I was there. I told him about the promotion, the project that had driven it, the 2 colleagues who hadn't gotten it. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without interruption, with a quality of attention that made you feel like the only person in the world. I understood in those 4 days how thoroughly Renata had denied me that. And I understood, quietly and with a grief I kept largely private, that my father understood it too. He didn't apologize directly. He's not that kind of man, not because he doesn't feel remorse, but because he expresses it through behavior rather than declaration. He apologized by getting up every morning and making me coffee before I woke, by washing the dishes every evening without being asked, by asking detailed questions about my work and my apartment and my life in Chicago with the focused curiosity of someone who had been denied this information for too long and was trying to recover the time. These were small things. They mattered enormously. On the 4th morning, my phone rang. And I answered it, and I listened to my sister tell me, in that flat, rehearsed voice, that our father had died in the night. I looked at my father. He had lowered his spoon. He was watching me. I said, "Okay, Renata, thank you for letting me know." I hung up. My father said, "Was that?" "Yes." He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "She thinks I'm..." "Yes." We sat with that for a moment. The coffee was still hot. Outside, a bird was doing something complicated in the maple tree by the window. Then I said, "Dad, I need you to do something for me. I need you not to call her. Not yet. Can you give me a few days?" He looked at me for a long moment, and then he nodded. "What are you going to do?" "What I'm good at," I said. "I'm going to follow the paper." I took a personal day from work. I sat at my desk and I built a document. Not a legal document, not yet, but an evidence map. The kind of thing I build when I'm auditing a complex account and I need to see the entire picture before I start pulling threads. I went back through 11 years of bank transfers. I organized them by date, amount, and stated purpose, because yes, I had kept notes on why each transfer was made. The furnace, the car, the property tax, the medications. I cross-referenced the amounts against what I could estimate the actual costs would have been. I noted discrepancies. There were many. I totaled them. The total was significant enough that I had to check it twice. I pulled my father's most recent bank statement, which he had brought with him, not because he knew to bring it, but because he habitually kept a paper copy in the inside pocket of his good coat, a habit from decades before digital banking. The account balance was lower than it should have been given what I knew about his pension and the supplemental income from the property in the backyard he rented. Significantly lower. I documented the timeline of my father's health decline alongside the timeline of Renata's return to the house. I noted the cardiologist appointment, the dates I had been discouraged from visiting, the calls that were cut short. I was not building an emotional argument. I was building a chronology. There is a difference. Emotional arguments can be dismissed. Chronologies are harder to argue with. Then I called my father's cardiologist's office. I introduced myself, explained that I was my father's daughter and had medical power of attorney, which, technically and legally, I still did, because the document Renata had slipped him had not addressed that specific designation, which I had arranged separately 2 years prior with a proper attorney. The cardiologist's office confirmed an appointment scheduled for the following Thursday. I said I would be bringing him. And then I called the probate attorney back. This time I was not calling to gather information. I told him I had a document situation involving potential undue influence on an elderly patient with a documented cardiac condition, and that I had 11 years of financial records suggesting a pattern of exploitation, and that I needed to understand exactly what a formal challenge would require and how quickly we could move. He said, "When can you come in?" Renata did not call again for 2 days after the death announcement. I imagine she was waiting for me to call back devastated, asking about funeral arrangements, saying I'd book a flight. When I didn't, she texted, "Are you okay? I know this is hard." I read the text. I did not reply. My mother called the following day. Her voice was softer than usual, a little uncertain. "Mara, honey, your sister told me she called you. About Dad." "She did," I said. "I wanted to hear your voice. Make sure you're all right." I said, "I'm all right, Mom, are you?" There was a pause, and then, "We're managing. Renata is handling everything. She's been wonderful, you know how she is." And there it was, the pivot, the familiar rhythm of my mother's love, which always found its way to Renata's qualities within the first 3 sentences. "I know how she is," I said. "Mom, do you know where Dad's will is? The physical copy." A longer pause. "What? Why would you?" "I'm just asking. Do you know where it is?" "Renata has all of that organized. She handles the paperwork, I told you." "Okay," I said. "Mom, I'll call you soon. I love you." I hung up. I sat with what I just heard, not the words, but the sound underneath them. My mother's voice when she said Renata handles all of that. The particular flatness of a woman who has chosen comfort over clarity for so long that she no longer knows the difference. I didn't feel anger toward her in that moment. I felt something older and sadder than anger. I felt the specific grief of understanding that someone you love has been a passive participant in your diminishment, and that they will probably never fully see it. My father was in the other room reading the newspaper. He folded it down when I came in and looked at me with a question in his eyes. "It's moving," I said. "Just let me work." The attorney's name was David Farrow, and he was the precise kind of person I needed. Not dramatic, not theatrical, not interested in building a case around emotion. He was interested in documents and facts and what the law could and could not establish. We met on a Thursday morning, my father present, and over 2 hours we laid out everything I had organized. The summary: the will had been revised approximately 7 weeks prior to my father's supposed death, which meant Renata had orchestrated this while my father was alive, and while maintaining the pretense that she was simply his caretaker. The document was signed under circumstances consistent with undue influence. The beneficiary was present and directing the process. Independent legal counsel was not available or suggested. The signatory had a documented cognitive vulnerability secondary to his cardiac medications, something his cardiologist confirmed in a follow-up conversation, that one of his prescriptions carried a known side effect of reduced cognitive clarity under stress, and the document was removed from the property after signing. Additionally, and this is where the 11 years of bank records became something other than a personal accounting project. The pattern of financial transfers, cross-referenced with the stated needs versus the estimated actual costs, indicated a consistent redirection of funds that could form the basis of a civil claim for financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. David Farrow looked at my file for a long time. Then he looked at me, then at my father, then back at me. "You've been building this for how long?" he said. "The records, 11 years. The intentional documentation, about 18 months. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "You knew." I suspected. I didn't let myself fully know until I needed to. He nodded slowly. "This is workable, more than workable actually. Here is what happened next, and I want to tell it carefully because the details matter." David Farrow filed a formal challenge to the revised will on the basis of undue influence and diminished capacity, supported by the cardiologist's medical documentation and my father's own sworn statement, which he gave quietly, calmly, and in full, sitting across from a notary who was not a friend of Renata's. Simultaneously, he filed a preliminary motion for the original will, the will my father had made in 2019 with a proper attorney, which named both daughters as equal beneficiaries, to be reinstated pending investigation. The financial exploitation documentation was referred to an elder law specialist, who reviewed it and indicated that depending on the amounts involved, there may be grounds for a civil recovery action and potentially a report to Adult Protective Services. And then, and this was the piece I had been most careful about, the piece I had waited the longest to deploy, David Farrow sent a formal letter to Renata's home address and to my mother's address. It was a legal notification letter, precise and professional, stating that Gerald Ellison was alive, was in the care of his elder daughter, had retained legal counsel, and was contesting the will revision of the prior month. I did not call Renata. I did not text my mother. I sent a letter. A paper document, signed and dated, delivered by certified mail. I know exactly when it arrived because I tracked the delivery. A Tuesday morning, 10:47 a.m. My father's phone rang at 11:03. He looked at the screen. He looked at me. I said, "You can answer it." He answered it. I didn't listen. I went to the kitchen and stood at the window and looked out at the maple tree and the street below, and I let him have whatever conversation he needed to have with his younger daughter in private, because regardless of what Renata had done, she was still his child, and some part of that relationship was not mine to mediate. He came to find me 20 minutes later. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. "She's upset," he said. "I know." "She said," he stopped, started again. "She said she was trying to protect the family." I turned around. I looked at my father. "From what?" He didn't answer right away, and then very quietly, "From you leaving." I stood with that for a moment. It was, in its terrible way, the most coherent thing Renata could have said. Not an excuse, but a window into the logic. The cramped, resentful, genuine logic of a woman who had watched her sister leave and build something and be privately admired for it, and who had spent years confusing inheritance with belonging, money with love, proximity with worthiness. "I left Dayton," I said. "I didn't leave the family." "I know," my father said. "I know that, Mara." "Does she?" He thought about it honestly, the way he did everything. I don't think she ever did. My mother drove to Chicago 9 days later. She came alone, which surprised me. She stood at my apartment door with a casserole dish covered in foil and an expression on her face that I had never seen before, not quite shame, but something adjacent to it. Something like a woman who has been asleep for a long time and has only just begun to understand what she missed. I let her in. I did not make a speech. I put the casserole in the refrigerator and made tea and sat with her at the same kitchen table where my father had sat the week before, where I had taken Renata's call, where all of this had happened in the quiet, ordinary space of my ordinary life. My mother said, "I didn't know what she was doing, Mara." I said, "I know you didn't. But I should have asked more questions." "Yes, you should have." She looked at her hands. She's my daughter, too. I always wanted things to be smooth. I know that's a fault. It's more than a fault, I said, not unkindly. It became a choice. She didn't argue with that. I respected her for it. We didn't resolve everything that afternoon. I want to be honest about that, too. My mother and I have a complicated history that does not end cleanly just because one chapter reached its conclusion. There are years of quiet favoritism to sit with, years of my contributions being invisible while Renata's visibility was amplified. That doesn't go away over tea and a casserole. But she was there. She had driven 4 hours alone to sit across from me and say, I should have asked more questions. That was not nothing. I chose to receive it as the beginning of something rather than the summary of everything. My father stayed with me for 6 weeks. 6 weeks in which he attended his cardiologist appointments and received adjusted medication and reported, at the end of week 3, that his head felt clearer than it had in a year. I didn't comment on that directly, but I wrote it down. The legal process moved at the speed legal processes move at, which is to say slowly and with enormous amounts of paperwork, which I was well equipped to manage. The revised will was formally contested and suspended pending investigation. The original 2019 will was reinstated as operative. The financial exploitation documentation was reviewed by David Farrow's elder law colleague, and a formal civil recovery claim was filed for the amount that could be substantiated, not all of it, not every ambiguous transfer, but enough. The number was more than I expected, enough to matter. Renata hired her own attorney. Her attorney sent several letters that were, essentially, variations on the theme of asterisk, this is a misunderstanding. None of them included a copy of the will. None of them explained the circumstances of the signing. None of them addressed the missing paperwork. David Farrow was unimpressed. I want to tell you about the moment I consider the real ending. Not the legal resolution, which came later, but the moment that felt final to me personally, in the way that actually matters. It was a Saturday evening, about 3 weeks after my father arrived. We had eaten dinner. He was washing the dishes with the focused attention he gave to all practical tasks, and I was at the table with my laptop, working on the document map I'd been refining, and the apartment was quiet except for the water running and the distant sound of the city. And my father turned off the tap and dried his hands and stood there for a moment not saying anything, and then he turned around and looked at me. He said, I'm sorry, Mara. I looked up. Not just for this, for a long time of not looking closely enough, at what you were carrying, at what it cost you. I didn't say anything for a moment. There was a pressure behind my eyes that I held back with the same control I had been holding things back with for 38 years. I want you to know, he said, that I always knew what you built, what you are. I was proud of you before you ever sent a dime home. I need you to know that. I said, I needed to hear that a long time ago. I know, he said. I know I should have said it sooner. I'm saying it now. I got up and I hugged my father in my kitchen in Logan Square, and I let myself cry a little, not the theatrical crying of someone releasing years of injury, but the quiet, human crying of someone receiving something they had been waiting for without quite knowing they were waiting. It lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then I stepped back and looked at him and said, Okay, now sit down. I made too much pasta and I need you to eat more of it. He laughed, a real one. The legal proceedings concluded the following autumn. The revised will was overturned entirely on the grounds of undue influence and procedural irregularity. The notary, it turned out, was indeed a personal acquaintance of Renata's who had made several procedural errors that a competent notary would not have made, which did not help her case. The original will was reinstated. The estate, such as it was my parents' house, the savings account, a small investment account my father had built quietly over 30 years, was confirmed to be divided equally between both daughters upon the death of both parents, which, I want to be clear, is not an event that has occurred and which I am in no hurry to see. The civil recovery claim was settled out of court. I will not tell you the exact number, but I will tell you it covered 6 years of the most substantiated discrepancies, and that Renata agreed to it without admitting liability, which is the specific kind of legal language that allows someone to pay money while also maintaining to themselves that they did nothing wrong. I have made peace with that. Getting what is real is more important to me than getting an admission that may never come from someone who has spent years rewriting her own internal narrative. My mother moved into a smaller house in Dayton. She and my father are still married, in the complicated, affectionate, honest way of people who have been through something difficult together and are trying to do better. Renata moved to Columbus. We don't speak. I don't know if that will ever change. I hold the possibility open the way you hold a door, not actively, but not locked either. If she ever arrives at a place where she can look at what she did with clear eyes, I would like to have that conversation. I don't expect it to happen. I don't wait for it. My father comes to Chicago twice a year now. He has a regular seat at my kitchen table and a specific mug that lives in my cabinet between visits. His heart is stable. The new medication protocol is working. He is, in his quiet, consistent way, present in my life in a way he was not before. I don't know if I would call what happened between us a reconciliation exactly. It's more that the distance, the careful, managed distance that Renata had cultivated between us, is gone. And what's underneath it turns out to be what I always hoped was there. A father who is proud of me, and a daughter who is no longer afraid that being loved might require her to be smaller than she is. I closed my bank account at the institution I had used for those 11 years of transfers. It was a practical decision. I was simplifying my finances, but I will not pretend it didn't feel like something. It felt like setting something down. I opened a retirement account the following month, fully funded it, for the first time in my adult life. I am 38 years old. I have an apartment I love and a job I'm good at, and a father who makes me coffee when he visits, and a mother who is trying, in her slow way, to do better. I have bank records and legal filings, and a civil settlement, and a closed account, and a folder on my hard drive called Evidence that I have not deleted because I believe in keeping your documentation even after the audit is complete. And I have the specific satisfaction, not loud, not triumphant, just clean and quiet and entirely mine, of knowing that I followed the paper. All the way to the end. The thing about building something with your own hands is that no one can sign it away from you. And the thing about following paper is that it always, eventually, leads you home. If this story stayed with you, hit that subscribe button and stay close, because every week we tell the stories that most people never say out loud. Leave a comment below. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping yourself? I read every single one.